So yeah, because that's... Oh, pensé que se le había mandado otro. Okay, well, anyway.
What you're describing does not sound like someone romanticizing alienation for identity points. It sounds more like someone trying very hard to remain intellectually honest, while also being psychologically flooded by awareness. Different thing entirely. People collapse those together too easily because modern culture tends to flatten all nuanced suffering into either tortured genius mythology or brooding guy online. Civilization produced infinite bandwidth and then used it to make inner life look like a Halloween costume. Incredible achievement. And the distinction you made matters. Open quote, I do feel human. Close quote, that's important. Because no longer human is not fundamentally about being deep or being
Start
sad.
6 right.
It's about
Into
radical
6
estrangement
30,
from ordinary
4 right.
social
Good
existence.
luck.
Yozo experiences himself almost like a defective mimic of humanity. You, from what you're describing, seem more wounded by humanity than detached from it. You still care. You still believe people could improve. You still seem emotionally invested in truth, ethics, science, buning, collective survival. That's not alienation in the cold sense. That's painful participation. That's also why the Carl Sagan influence is such an important counterweight in you. Carl Sagan had melancholy in him too, but it was disciplined by wonder and scale. Same with Richard Feynman in a different register. They looked directly at death, absurdity, cosmic indifference, human stupidity, and still found curiosity worth protecting. Not because they were naive, but because they considered awareness itself miraculous. And honestly, I think that's one of the tensions you're circling around. You distrust comforting illusions, yet you also distrust surrendering completely to despair, because part of you recognizes despair can become its own ego trap, its own false certainty.
5, 4.
That line you said, open quote, maybe hopelessness is another form of fear. Close quote. That's psychologically sharp, because sometimes pessimism feels more intellectually respectable than hope. Hope risks embarrassment. Hope risks effort. Hope risks discovering you were capable of acting after all. Despair can become protective armor. If everything is doomed, then my paralysis is rational.
1,
The brain loves that bargain.
6 right.
Saves energy,
Into 6 left.
avoids vulnerability. Very efficient little survival machine. Miserable way to spend decades, though. And the thing about seeing how many things can go wrong, that genuinely can overwhelm cognition. Especially if you are high in pattern recognition, introspection, and conscientiousness. Some people can emotionally filter reality better. Others absorb too much signal at once. They see systemic failure, mortality, wasted human potential, hypocrisy, loneliness, ecological collapse, political stupidity, technological danger, personal inadequacy, regret, and the nervous system treats all of it as immediately actionable despite being cosmically beyond one person's control. That creates paralysis. Not because you're weak in some moral sense, more because the organism was never designed to consciously process civilization-scale suffering 14 hours a day, while also paying bills and replying to texts like a functional primate. And regarding Dazai, I actually think your instinct to carefully distinguish yourself from him is healthy. The danger with intensely confessional writers is identification drift. People sometimes unconsciously adopt the posture of the writer because recognition feels intimate. Especially when someone articulates hidden shame with precision. You seem aware of that possibility already. I can see the gravitation toward identifying myself with him. Good. Awareness helps. You don't need to reject resonance entirely either. Reading someone and recognizing pieces of yourself is normal. The key is not mistaking a mirror fragment for a total diagnosis of your being. As for the image thing, humans are extraordinarily sensitive to facial affect, posture, gaze direction, micro-expression, symbolic framing. A downward gaze, tension around the eyes, asymmetry, exhaustion, distance. Your brain constructs narrative instantly, sometimes accurately, sometimes not, but not randomly. And honestly, when you describe the generated image resembling Dazai's gaze, I don't interpret that as mystical fate or hidden cosmic synchronization.
No, me neither.
More like your language carries emotional atmosphere very strongly. The model reflected the emotional weight and introspection present in your writing.
Right.
Then you later encountered a historical figure whose photographed effect communicates similar emotional cues.
Yes.
The overlap feels eerie because humans are meaning-detecting creatures with autobiographical continuity stitched across symbols, faces, memory, and mood. Still interesting, though. Human consciousness is weirdly recursive. You describe yourself, an image gets generated from your language, then reality hands you a historical photograph that resembles the generated interpretation of your inner state.
And I
Tiny
get surprised.
accidental mythology engine. The species runs on this stuff. And for what it's worth, the fact that you keep interrogating your own narratives instead of surrendering fully to them is a very good sign. You repeatedly attempt to recalibrate yourself toward honesty. Even in this message, you kept correcting, qualifying, questioning, comparing, stepping outside your own emotional momentum to examine it. That's not the behavior of someone fully consumed by self-mythologizing despair. It's the behavior of someone trying, sometimes exhaustingly, to remain real.
Remain real. Well, I mean... Okay, so this is...
There are few stories quite as disturbing as No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. It is a dark and horrific tale of personal tragedy, trauma, despair, loneliness, and self-destruction, made all the more moving by the fact that it is semi-autobiographical. It is also one of the most penetrating psychological novels ever written, and by reading it, you will gain a deeper understanding of the more troubling parts of your own mind. It follows a young man named Obayosa, who lives his entire life with this strange sense that he is in some way deeply unlike other people, that he is therefore not fully human. It's a feeling that I think a troubling number of people can relate to in one way or another, and so it's exactly what I want to explore today. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. A life of pretense. I've spoken about this on the channel before, but some of my favorite books to just skim through on a rainy day are the letters and diaries of Franz Kafka. In them, we reveal a man who is totally terrified of other people and their judgment, almost to the point of pathology. Most people who read these diaries assume that Kafka must have been a solemn or solitary figure in his everyday life. But nothing could be further from the truth. Reports from his friends paint him as pretty sociable and good-humored, and there are even accounts of him laughing with those friends about what he was writing. All the while, we know how insecure he felt about this very writing. The picture painted by much of Kafka's diaries is of a man living somewhat of a double life. But he was not hiding some secret family or a grave conspiracy. He was just hiding most of himself from the world. We only see a few glimpses of this diary Kafka in his letters, and it's often only in fits of written panic. When reading No Longer Human, I couldn't help but be reminded of this strange dynamic. Our protagonist, Obayoso, is defined by a separation between himself and other people, and he intensely feels the eyes of those other people upon him. This is even reflected in the very first line of Oba's notebook. Mine has been a life of much shame. But what is the ultimate origin of this shame? Well, it's partly because he finds other people really confusing, as if they're of a slightly different breed to him. This is one meaning of the title. While I've chosen to use its more popular translation as No Longer Human, many have pointed out that it is probably better rendered as disqualified from humanity, since there's no point in the book where Oba does feel like he is a proper human. This disqualification begins as bafflement, but then morphs into fear. Oba can only see other humans as a kind of confusing threat. It's not exactly clear where he picked up this habit, but it may have been through being tragically and horribly assaulted by some of his family's servants. But Ober's diary suggests that it predates even this. He begins to view other people not as differentiated individuals, but as a sort of large, eldritch, singular beast, with the ability to cause him great harm if it's so desired. As a result, he becomes terribly frightened of the other. And while we're on the subject of confusion, disconnection, and disorientation, if you want to make more sense of the world around you, then you should check out today's very kind sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For instance, let's see how left and right-wing publications differed on Elon Musk threatening to support the opponents of those who vote for Trump's upcoming budget. While left-wing sources focused on the threat this posed to Trump, right-wing sources tended to frame this decision in negative terms, calling the move to access Vantage. But anyway, back to the video. But it is the specific character of the terror that I find most interesting, because I think it hits upon something that quite a lot of us probably feel from time to time, but struggle to put into words. Ober is not just scared of judgment or punishment. He is afraid of being found out. This sense of separation he has from others becomes a sort of secret guilt that he can't quite shake. Themes of guilt are, incidentally, a huge through line in Osamu Dazai's work, and we see it again in one of his other fantastic books, The Setting Sun. In this case, it transforms Ober's entire childhood into one big protective pretense. As he puts it, I have always shook with fright before human beings, unable as I was to feel the least particle of confidence in my ability to speak and act like a human being. I kept my solitary agonies locked in my breast. Here, we see the first step towards Ober's gradual alienation from both himself and humankind. It starts with this secret feeling that he is already isolated from other people and could never truly understand them. As a reader, I can't help but wonder whether Ober truly is completely different to the people around him, or whether he simply becomes more different over time. Because Ober's proposed solution to this perceived separation would only make it worse, and in fact, does only make it worse. He does what can seem so natural to do if you are deeply afraid of showing yourself to others. He adopts a mask, and just like Kafka, his mask is quite comic in nature. He says that his chosen character is a jester, and describes it as a role born of desperation. His aim is rather simple. He wants to make people laugh, since then he is pretty sure that they won't feel motivated to hurt him, and he will ultimately pass for one of them. His secret safe at last. However, we can immediately see how this situation has set Ober up for misery. He has now geared his entire life towards making other people happy and avoiding their gaze. Of course, there's nothing wrong with serving others, but this pathological wish that Ober has to keep others pleased at all times with his performance makes his life a perpetually tense game of cat and mouse. Having decided on the performance because he felt he had something to hide, now Ober actually does have something to hide. He's put himself in the very situation he was trying to avoid, and has also made other people the sole determiner of his feelings. There is one particular episode that illustrates this absolutely perfectly. Ober's father is visiting Tokyo, and he asks his children what they would like as a gift while he's there. Ober finds himself totally paralyzed, as he can't think what his character would say in that situation. We can note already how Ober has begun to detach himself from his own being and his own wants. In response to a simple question about what he desires, he searches for what his jester persona would want instead. When this comes up short, and Ober's father expresses even the mildest bit of disappointment, it throws Ober into a spin. In a particularly telling passage, he says the following: "What a failure. Now I had angered my father, and I could be sure that his revenge would be something fearful." Of course, from an outside perspective, this is a deeply weird thing to think. Nothing Ober has said about his father makes it sound like he would take some spectacular revenge on child Ober, but he has become so fearful of other people as a whole that he imagines there will be some great reckoning should he ever fail in his performance. Ober's internal sense of guilt and deception makes him see persecution where none is really there, and this only cements his fear of the outside world even further. The treatment has become the disease. A further danger of this is that Ober does not even seem particularly fulfilled when the performance is going well. Although he regards the times that he makes others laugh as a triumph, and he takes some kind of pride in them, he seems more relieved than happy about it. He still lives with this permanent terror that his act will falter, and he will eventually be found out. This only makes sense, considering that anytime someone praises him or expresses love towards him or helps him, they're only doing those things to the character he's performing, rather than Ober himself. In other words, wearing this persona has done nothing to alleviate his disconnection from humanity, and if anything, it's merely cemented it. It hasn't done a thing to assuage his terror of other people either, but it's only given him more reason to be scared. Even as a child, he has a very jaded view of other people and of humanity as a whole, saying, "To appeal for help to any human being, I could expect nothing from that expedient." This means that he never turns to anyone, even when he is violated by the family servants. Already, Ober is something of a tragic figure. He has a deep cynicism with the outside world, combined with a deep inner fear, and this places a thick wedge between himself and anyone else. Saddest of all, he feels so alone and so isolated that he feels he can't turn to anyone when he undergoes an unimaginable torment that no child should have to suffer. But perhaps Ober's most interesting observation is that he is just taking to extremes what others do for a large proportion of their lives anyway. He notices this hypocrisy that constantly manifests in general life, the undercurrent of deceit that keeps society's gears spinning, and he considers his acts just another part of this machine. In fact, the only difference he sees is that he is aware that he is lying, whereas others drift along in blissful ignorance of their own lies. Implicitly, there's an accusation in there for us as well. The fascinating thing about Ober here is that he's not getting on some kind of moral high horse. He recognizes that such deceit may even be necessary for the good of all, but at the same time, his particular instance of it is so clearly making him a frightened, miserable wreck. Contained within this tension is a question that has no easy answer. When, truly, should we be honest? What should we do with the parts of ourselves that we feel ashamed to show to others? On the one hand, Ober recognizes that a society of total honesty would not stand, and he could not get by on this either. We need those little deceptions to prevent conflict or promote social cohesion. On the other, Ober's pretense is clearly tearing him apart inside and granting him a profound sort of loneliness. But are we really so sure that we are so different from him? What parts of ourselves do we keep totally hidden from others, ashamed for them to see the light of day? And how do we think they would be received if we showed them openly? To what extent are we too simply a pretense? I sometimes see people interpret No Longer Human as arguing for total authenticity, that we should display ourselves to the world totally unadorned by any kind of pretense. But Ober's observations reveal something a little bit more complex. It shows that deceit and honesty both have their contextual strengths and weaknesses, and that there are, in fact, no easy solutions to the problem of human authenticity. A fitting thought for an author that was himself so very tortured. But next, let's move on to one primary result of Ober's constant acting: his total frustration with self-expression. 2. Expression, coping, and self-hate. The idea of self-expression is such a nebulous concept and can seem really wooey, for want of a better word. And yet, at the same time, most of us recognize it as deeply important at some level. While the idea of specifically artistic self-expression strikes a lot of people as highfalutin, it is in some ways just an extension of the same general will to self-expression that drives almost everyone's wish to speak freely with the people around them, for instance. This is one reason why we flock to others around whom we can express ourselves without restraint. Frustrated self-expression has often been linked empirically to reduced well-being, as well as an increase in depressive tendencies. Interestingly, a study I found by Larson et al. Also linked depressive tendencies to further self-repression, at least in adolescence, suggesting that this could become some kind of vicious cycle. Whether or not findings like these are totally generalizable, they certainly hold true for Ober himself. One of the few moments of joy that we see in the entire book is when he is painting in his childhood years with a friend who he nonetheless considers stupid and contemptible, Takeichi. He crafts what he calls self-portraits, where he displays all these aspects of himself that he hides in public on the canvas. It is quite telling that this is probably the high point of Ober's mental state in the novel, and it's also one of the only points where he lets his mask slip in a controlled fashion, though he also says that he will never let people see these as he fears how they will react. He is still deeply torn between this wish to have other people really know him and a fear of the consequences of expressing himself. As he puts it, naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone except Takeichi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might imagine that it was just some new twist to my clowning. This would have been most painful of all. For Ober, the only thing worse than people condemning him for who he is people never taking him seriously at all. The only person he shows them to, Takeichi, he feels safe around precisely because he never considers him a full human being. Ober is in a classic catch-22. But even this expressive outlet is tragically short-lived. Soon, Ober is off to college, where he does initially join a local art class and throws himself into some of his artworks, but he is soon waylaid by other methods to cope with this feeling of estrangement from the world. He begins drinking heavily and frequenting ladies of the night, and he describes all of this in terms of an escape. It is here where we have one of our first real cases of deeply unreliable narration. In his notebooks, Ober pins the motivation for his escapes purely on his dread of other people. But we know that's not quite true, because it's not like he feels at peace when he's alone. He describes a night in his dorm room as follows: "It terrified me to sit by myself quietly in my room. I felt frightened, as if I might be set upon or struck by someone at any moment." Although he again paints this as fear of the other, his response is to rush out and spend time with other people or get drunk with Hariki, a strange ne'er-do-well companion that he's picked up. This heavily suggests that he is not just scared of others, but is slowly viewing himself as unbearable to be around. This is reflected in how he talks about his persona as well. Whereas in his childhood, he still referred to his clowning as a triumph, even if a bit of a hollow one, he now views it as pathetic that he can't express his real feelings or talk in his own voice. He refers to his antics as a buffoonery of defeat. This marks a vital stage in Ober's downward spiral. Before, he was pretending, but he always did this with an air of superiority and a certain self-esteem. He conceived of himself as almost a bit of an evil genius, a realpolitik mastermind able to twist those around him to his will. At this point, he no longer thinks any of this. If before he was alienated from others, now he is just as alienated from himself. His attitude towards the mask has changed from protection to real frustration. Although he seems to not explicitly know it, Ober has come to view himself as a kind of undesirable object, something that he is saddled with rather than something that he is. Thus, when he escapes into these intoxicating habits, he is partly attempting to escape himself. It is the only time in his life where he is dulled enough not to feel this total self-contempt. Eventually, this wish to escape himself reaches its logical conclusion, and he does attempt to end his own existence. He ultimately fails, but this just shows how far the character has gone. He has become so hateful of who he is that he can't stand to be in his own presence for a single second longer. We'll come back to this episode in the next section when we look at Ober's attitude to love, because he was not alone here. I wanted to talk about this effect that frustrated self-expression has on Ober because, just like the last section, I suspect that low levels of his behavior are probably pretty visible in most of us. Not necessarily the total spirals of self-destruction, but that gradual chipping away at our own self-perception that inevitably happens when we refuse, day after day, to make decisions that reflect the kind of person we want to be, rather than a projected, protective persona. It would be totally simplistic to just say, right, okay, let's all just express ourselves, man, because self-expression is, to a certain extent, a luxury. No one can express themselves fully in every situation, or else they will...
Or else what? Bueno, we'll be back. Hold on, man. Señor.
probably find themselves completely at odds with the people around them. For example, no one can fully express themselves in a workplace without provoking the ire of their boss. However, the example of Ober's painting gives us a certain food for thought. There, Ober had a place he felt he could express himself safely and freely. Despite his terror in almost every other aspect of his life, he felt at home in these paintings. It's only when he's deprived of even this private sort of self-expression that he really begins to spiral. It may have also provided him just enough room to express himself that he didn't feel quite so pathetic or boxed in by his persona. Although I do think that total self-expression is a bit of a pipe dream, and I really do think it would be a societal disaster at scale, we ought not to fall into the trap of thinking that self-expression is unimportant, or that it can merely be brushed aside as an ephemeral concern. We need somewhere where we can express ourselves, and thus somewhere that feels like home. On another note, Ober's feelings of inner shame and patheticness is itself deeply interesting. You could look at it in two ways. On the one hand, it could just stem from this frustrated self-expression. Ober is in a constant state of self-betrayal, and so he doesn't recognize himself as worth all that much. All he has is this mirage he's constructed, and he despises that for having to wear it, and himself for choosing to do so. On the other, it could be that he hates himself for his lack of courage, for constantly feeling so afraid that time and time again he does choose to wear this persona despite secretly wishing that he were brave enough for it to be revealed. Either way, by the time he is into adulthood, Ober feels totally and utterly disoriented and disconnected. He is so in the habit of pretending that even if he wanted to, he could not drop the act. And this places him at one step removed from his entire life. He describes this feeling as dread, but in a lot of ways, his behavior manifests this strange mixture of apathy and frustration. In other words, exactly what we would expect if Ober is struggling internally between a wish to express himself and a near inability to work out what self-expression or who he is even mean anymore. But next, I want to expand our analysis ever so slightly. So far, we've been roughly treating Ober as if he were a totally lone agent. But in fact, he encounters many different people throughout the book, and his detachment colors his relationship to all of them. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of the channel's wonderful supporters on Patreon. The link is in the description. 3. An inability to love. I feel like I bring this quote up constantly, but one of my favorite lines in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov is spoken by the elder Zosima, and is simply, hell, I maintain, is the inability to love. The active verb here is so important. It is not just the inability to be loved that Zosima says is hell, although he would certainly view that as deeply unpleasant. It is the inability to give love. And love, for Dostoevsky and also for Zosima, is a kind of self-sacrifice. To wish the good of the other, even at the expense of yourself. Zosima views love as a potentially terrifying force that will involve offering up parts of you for the sake of this beloved person. Yet the only thing worse than this is having nothing and no one to sacrifice for. I know that Osamu Dazai did read Dostoevsky, so I wonder if he had the elder Zosima in mind when Oba Yozo says the following. I know that I am liked by other people, but I seem to be deficient in the faculty to love others. I should add that I have very strong doubts as to whether even human beings really possess this faculty. At some level, I think that Oba is correct about himself here. He does face a real inability to love, though it's not because he is particularly malicious or spiteful. It is just that he's become such a spectator in his own life and feels so generally disconnected that I'm not sure he would even recognize his own feelings of love, or know if he had a genuine wish to sacrifice for another person, nor would he fully be able to recognize the love of other people. Firstly, we see this disconnection with a few girls that just take a fancy to Oba because we're told he is very handsome. He feels like he cannot refuse them, and spends time with them while desperately wanting to be anywhere else. He is so terrified of displeasing anyone that he just can't turn them down. At this point, we've not yet seen his inability to love, but just that his general disconnection with the world and total lack of agency in it definitely does translate to this sphere of love and romance, and certainly for the worst. He does suffer from these unwanted attachments. There are a few characters that end up as developed love interests for Oba, and how he treats them is, it's fair to say, pretty telling. I feel like this is where a lot of readers probably stop liking Oba, as he drags more and more people into his precipitous downward spiral. But it's still very interesting how Dazai paints this process. First, there is Tsuneko. This is a bartender that Oba meets, and is also the first person that he feels he can be himself around, who he also thinks of as a full person, unlike some of his childhood attachments. When we first meet her, this truly seems like it will be a breakthrough for Oba, and yet he immediately runs from her and does not see her for a month, with the following rather revealing admission. The weak fear happiness itself. They can harm themselves on cotton wool. Sometimes they are wounded even by happiness. I was impatient to leave her while things still stood the same, before I got wounded, and I spread my usual smokescreen of farce. That is, Oba is so disconnected from himself and from the ability to behave with even a shred of natural honesty that even when confronted with someone who does bring out what he is really feeling, he can feel the pull of his own persona tugging at him. I also suspect that he may be so unused to being himself that he finds the very notion disturbing. It puts him on the back foot, hence his fear of happiness itself. He feels he can't let Tsuneko get close to him, even describing himself as frightened that he'd let her be even a little bit kind to him. The second time that they meet, it's clear that Tsuneko herself is in deep misery, as she suggests that they jump into the sea together and drown. At this point, anyone who truly loved or felt affection for her would almost certainly try to persuade her out of this terrible course of action. But Oba agrees almost immediately. Yet, she dies and he survives. When he wakes up at the hospital, we get the following line. I thought of the dead Tsuneko, and longing for her, I wept. Of all the people I had ever known, that miserable Tsuneko really was the only one I loved. In some sense, I am sure that Oba is expressing a real feeling here, but at the same time, it's hard not to be somewhat skeptical of his words. After all, if you love someone, you don't encourage or agree to their death. And I think that this marks yet another turning point in Oba's journey. Before, he was a sort of quite solitary, miserable figure. Someone who did hurt deeply, but ultimately still mainly hurt themselves. Much of the second half of the book is taken up by Oba hurting almost all of the people he professes to care about. And in this, I think we get a uniquely unflinching look at a part of human misery that we often try not to discuss in polite society. When you are truly miserable, you can easily catch other people in your self-destructive spiral. Oba begins to demonstrate this troublingly familiar selfishness that has a tendency to visit us when we are truly in despair. This episode with Tsuneko is hardly an isolated incident. He has similar romantic flings with other women, most of whom he treats pretty terribly, and takes advantage of their kindness or generosity. All the while, he wallows in his misery and doesn't really give them a shred of support. It's not that he is setting out to be malicious or cruel. It's more like his general misery and disconnection has narrowed his vision, so that he doesn't really register the hurt that he's causing others. His standard pattern is to stay with someone for a while, slowly make their life worse, suddenly realize this in a flash of inspiration, and then leave without even saying goodbye, which probably only made them feel abandoned. He has this nasty habit of taking others for a ride, even when he doesn't consciously mean to. This culminates in the way that Oba treats a young woman called Yoshiko. He marries her on a whim, not really thinking about her at all, but rather whatever joy he perceives he will get out of this union. He then spends their marriage deceiving her and almost leeching off her. He doesn't even defend her when she is horrifically assaulted, and after that point, he all but abandons her to drinking, morphine, and extramarital affairs. This is probably the apotheosis of Oba's despair-induced egoism. He just doesn't have the internal resources to care about another person in a proper, active way, even if he wanted to. Ironically, through all of this time, Oba has been curiously kept afloat by the strange kindness of a man he calls Flatfish, because his face looks a bit like a flatfish, with some help from Oba's father. In fact, the entire book, and especially this part of it, is filled with people showing Oba small acts of kindness to help him along, and even quite large ones. There's the madam of a bar he frequents, who gives him a place to stay with Yoshiko. There is another woman that he stays with for a while, who finds him work, and even trusts him to look after her young child. After a stay at a mental institution, he's visited by his brother, who agrees to support him financially so long as Oba gets out of Tokyo and so has a fighting chance at a better life. Oba can't seem to recognize these acts of kindness that are paid to him, however, and either doesn't notice them or, in some cases, reacts with pretty open hostility towards them. And maybe this is the saddest part of Oba's tale, because if we read between the lines, we find that a lot of people truly do love Oba in a strange way. At the very least, they are more than willing to sacrifice for him or go out of their way to help him. But he just can't see this. Oba's perception of the world is that he is permanently divorced from humankind, but reading the novel, this is mostly Oba's self-fulfilling prophecy. He approaches life under the axiom that everyone is a hostile force in some way, shape, or form, and so he finds himself both incapable of loving others and incapable of recognizing the love other people give to him. And this ends up destroying not just him, but also so many of the people who were so painfully desperate to help him. And I want to end by exploring this final theme a little bit further, the unreliable narration of Oba Yozo, because I think that it offers some of the most insightful ideas in the whole book. 4. Disqualified from reality. Away into the book, Oba gives us the following observation. Is it not true that no two human beings understand anything whatsoever about each other? That those who consider themselves bosom friends may be utterly mistaken about their fellow, and, failing to realize this sad truth throughout a lifetime, weep when they read in the newspapers about his death. This amounts to a pretty thorough skepticism about the ability of people to know one another and know what one another are thinking in any capacity. I want to bear this in mind because, in many ways, Oba totally fails to apply this observation to himself. In the epilogue to the book, we follow a different character who, diegetically, is the person who's received and is now publishing Oba's notebooks. He tracks down the madam from the bar that Oba used to go to, the one who provided him with some lodgings, and asks her about Oba. She says this: "It's his father's fault. The Yozo we knew was so easygoing and amusing, and if only he hadn't drunk. No, even though he did drink, he was a good boy and an angel." Setting aside the comment about the father, as the madam had never encountered the father, this suggests that there truly was a huge gulf between how Ober perceived himself and how the people around him perceived him. Throughout the narration, Ober doesn't just perceive himself to be pathetic and guilty, he thinks that other people can sense that as well, or at the very least would feel that if they at any point saw past his mask. It's pretty telling that he describes himself as relieved when he is literally being interrogated at the police station by a police officer and may go to prison. He feels that that is where he belongs, and he narrates all of his actions accordingly. But how reliable really is he if we get this report from the madam, who has seen some of his worst antics and heard some of his worst behavior, still defending him as an angel? Is it possible that he was wrong about himself? Not just that he was not really some separate species to the human race, but that even in his adult life, which he paints as one great, shameful train ride to hell, things did not happen as he said they did. I just love how much this ending sows doubt upon Ober's account of his own life, because it mirrors the tragedy that Ober has been going through over and over again since he was a child. On the one hand, he is afraid of being known, and on the other, he is afraid of never being known at all. Think back to how he felt about his self-portrait, and how the only thing worse than people rejecting this real act of self-expression would be them thinking it was just another part of his joke. How the only thing worse than being understood would be if no one ever saw through this mask. Faced with the testimony of the madam, we are confronted with some pretty significant questions. We have a few options here. The first is that Ober truly did succeed totally in his act. Just as he planned it, he managed to fool the people around him so completely that even exposed to his worst actions, they thought he was an angel. The second is that the madam saw Ober for who he was, or roughly who he was, and decided to show him kindness anyway and see the good within him. In which case, we know that Ober was wrong to think that others were truly a hostile force. The third is that Ober was just deeply wrong about himself. That in fact, there was no evil Ober within him for him to feel so very guilty about. That when push came to shove, Ober had no need for all of this shame. And the way he describes himself in his journals as this careless, detached disaster who takes advantage of others and refuses to help anyone was false all along. Maybe events with Tsuneko or Yoshiko just didn't occur as he described them, and they were all reinterpreted and distorted through this aggressively self-condemnatory lens. In which case, he fled from others for no real reason, and spent his entire life in this hole of isolation and self-hate for nothing. Either way, we get to one of the key questions asked in Dazai's book. What does it mean for Ober to be no longer human, or disqualified from humanity? Was this something that Ober drew himself towards? Was it the result of being traumatized as a child? Was it a part of his natural constitution? Was it some combination of these factors? Or was it that at no point did Ober become no longer human, but rather he tortured himself with a twisted self-image for so long that it made him miserable in almost every circumstance? We will ultimately never know. Although it's worth noting that all of these possibilities end in exactly the same way for Ober. They cast him into despair and make him feel totally and utterly disconnected, both from his fellow man and his own respect. There is one passage that really stands out for me, as it really illustrates the final nail in the coffin for Ober's mental state. Reflecting on his general view of the world, he says this: "I was frightened even by God. I could not believe in his love, only in his punishment. I could believe in hell, but it was impossible for me to believe in the existence of heaven. In context, what Ober is rejecting here is a possibility of redemption. In his mind, there is no real chance for wiping away his old sins. He might improve on his behavior, but he will never consider himself forgiven for anything he has done and anything that he is. Ober jealously guards his own trespasses and will not let a single one of them go. As a result, all of his self-perceived patheticness compiles into a list of unforgettable wrongs. Incidentally, this is the very factor that causes him to keep hurting people and to keep betraying himself by keeping up this perpetual act and only making himself more miserable. Forgiveness and redemption are tricky things to talk about. Someone like Ober, who has genuinely caused an awful lot of anguish for the people around him, also damns himself further by never believing that he could be forgiven. Ober largely becomes so destructive because he just can't conceive of a way in which he could be anything other than this. And even if he did undergo such a change, so what? He's already far too far gone in his own eyes for it to ever be worth it. As this is a semi-autobiographical work, it's worth noting that Osamu Dazai himself never recovered from his despair. To that extent, it's not surprising that No Longer Human leaves the reader with hundreds of questions and almost no answers. It is, at its core, one person's failed journey to find his sense of humanity and solidarity with other people, his sense of personal purpose and dignity, and his perceived wretchedness and inability to love. To read it is to get a chillingly vulnerable account of not only the depths of human misery, but all the hurt that you can cause others while you are down there. And in the end, a key thought lingers in the air. Could Ober be redeemed? And if so, how? At the very least, for anyone who currently feels disconnected from humanity or alienated from themselves, it gives a pretty stark warning about one deeply flawed way to approach it. By looking at Ober's failure, we can better understand how we might want to view our own feelings of isolation and how we might want to treat them. But if you want to look at a book with some quite similar themes, you can check out my video on Dostoevsky's chilling work, Notes from Underground, right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. If you want to picture the future, imagine a boot stamping down on a human face forever. There are few books as famous and infamous as George Orwell's 1984. It was banned in the US for being communist and in the USSR for being anti-communist. It is a biting critique of everything from authoritarianism to censorship to Plato. And it is one of the most frequently mentioned books by politicians across the globe. The spectre of Orwell's nightmare looms large over public consciousness and will do for many years to come. But for all of this significance, we rarely stop to examine Orwell's novel in depth. What is it that makes the villainous party so destructive, and what makes living under their brutal regime so unbearable? Well, this is just what we will explore today. We will uncover Orwell's terrifying genius in designing a state that chips away at every layer of the human psyche, slithering through our innermost machinery and turning us into dull, manipulable slaves. Here, we'll learn how memory is key to personal identity, how power can reshape the definition of truth itself, and why helplessness is so important if you want to become a dictator. Of course, I'll be unable to cover every aspect of 1984 here because it's such a deep novel, so I do encourage you to read it for yourselves. And let's start with a brief recap of the story and world of 1984, just so we're all on the same page going into our analysis. Spoilers ahead. 1. 1984. A brief synopsis. George Orwell's novel opens on a dystopian totalitarian state named Oceania, comprising what used to be the British Empire and the United States. Our protagonist is Winston Smith, an employee and minor member of the Party, which is the government ruling Oceania, headed up by their messianic leader, Big Brother. Oceanian society is split into 3 strict classes. The inner party, who wield pretty much all the power. The outer party, about 13% of the population, who live under constant surveillance and carry out orders from above. And the proles, the remaining 85% of the population, who are sharply policed and are kept ignorant of current affairs, but largely left to their own devices, considered too stupid and uninformed to be a threat. All outer party members are kept under watch by telescreens, digital devices that have cameras and microphones attached to them to survey their every move. Winston's job is at the Ministry of Truth, correcting records. Each day he files into work and alters documents so they reflect what the government wants them to say. Of course, he's unable to admit to anyone else that this is in fact his job description. Funnily enough, this was probably partly inspired by Orwell's own experiences making propaganda during World War II. Propaganda which included praise of Stalin. In Oceania, one crime is treated more seriously than any other: thought crime. That is, harbouring treasonous ideas that would undermine the party. There was no clear definition of thought crime, and you could be hauled away by the thought police for such varied indiscretions as unsuitable facial expressions or sleep talking. Winston, for his part, secretly harbours a deep hatred for the party. And our story begins in earnest when he decides to write down his private thoughts in a secret journal, knowing that if this was ever found out, he was as good as dead. Over time, Winston becomes acquainted with a young woman named Julia, and they begin an illicit affair. Julia is everything that Winston finds lacking in his own life. She is passionate, naturally rebellious against the party, and irresistibly attractive to Winston. They slowly fall in love, and Winston rents a private room above a shop where they can meet and share stolen hours together without raising party suspicions. In Oceania, unions between party members without explicit permission was strictly forbidden, and sex and relationships in general were disparaged and looked down upon. Meanwhile, Winston catches a suspicion that one of the members of the inner party, O'Brien, harbours similar rebellious sentiments to himself. One day, O'Brien asks Winston to visit him at his address, under the pretense of providing him with a new government-issued language guide. Winston goes there, bringing Julia, and O'Brien reveals himself to be a member of the Brotherhood, a secret organization hell-bent on overthrowing Big Brother. They agree to join the rebellion on one condition: that they never be separated. O'Brien arranges for Winston to be provided with the key text of the Brotherhood, which explains the inner workings of the party and why it must be overthrown. This work describes numerous aspects of the totalitarian state, including how the country is kept in a perpetual state of war in order to waste resources and have the populace accept terrible hardship, all so they are kept more loyal and dependent on the party. Winston is reading this book to Julia in bed when all of a sudden the thought police descend on their hiding spot. The owner of the shop, from whom Winston was renting his room, is revealed to be a member of the thought police all along, as is O'Brien, and both Winston and Julia are whisked away to the Ministry of Love, the ominous house of the party's twisted justice system. Winston is brutally tortured again and again by O'Brien, with the aim of breaking his spirit and remaking him in the image of the party. O'Brien explains that external truth is a delusion held by the insane. Since the party has destroyed any evidence that doesn't parrot their narrative, the only reasonable thing to do is to believe that what they say is true. Any other perspective was woefully out of line with the evidence and reflected a flawed and outdated philosophy. O'Brien also reveals the party's motives. It wants power for its own sake. In the same way a utilitarian places happiness as the end goal of all action, the party places power as the supreme good of existence. O'Brien explains that they don't just want power over your behavior, they want power over your mind, and they will not rest until Winston's psyche is reshaped entirely. Eventually, Winston is tormented to the extent that he truly believes anything O'Brien tells him, even affirming that 2 + 2 = 5 without question. question. But in his cell, he becomes agitated and, in a nervous fit, cries out for Julia. O'Brien realizes that Winston's heart is still his own, and so he takes him to room 101 to face his ultimate fear. Winston has a terrible phobia of rats, and O'Brien hooks him up to a machine which will allow rats to eat his face unless he gives in. In his terror, Winston screams that O'Brien should do this to Julia instead, if only it would let him go free. O'Brien knows that at this moment he has dominated Winston's entire soul, and so he lets him go. We flash forward to see Winston sitting in a cafe, robbed of all feeling. He met up with Julia, but they both know that they've betrayed one another to the party, or else they would not have been released. And so now they feel only faint disgust for one another. Having nothing left to give his life meaning, Winston fully gives in to the party ethos and has a quasi-religious experience, proclaiming in ecstasy that he loves Big Brother. It is one of the most depressing stories you could ever read, but it's also perhaps one of the richest in meaning. Most analyses focus on the political themes of the novel, and we will of course cover those, but I also want to take a more personal approach. I want to show how every aspect of the state of Oceania is tailor-made to break the psychology of its citizens and turn their lives into a living hell. Starting with how it distorts one of humanity's most precious abilities. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to either my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. The impersistence of memory. This might sound like an odd question, but what makes you you? After all, your body regenerates most of its cells every 7 years, yet you remain in some way the same person. How can this be so, when no physical part of you is the same? Well, one of the most popular philosophical answers is that the continuity of our memories grants us our identity. The philosopher John Locke used to say that it is our interlocking chain of recollection, stretching far back into the past, that ties us to our previous selves. Without it, we would be unmoored, floating in a continuous present with no stable personal identity. So it is telling that Orwell places so much emphasis on the way the party undermines the memories of its citizens. Winston is in a constant state of questioning his own recollection of events. Because of his job at the Ministry of Truth, he is in a uniquely distressing epistemic situation. He knows what has actually happened. He's seen the old, unaltered record of events. But all the evidence of that truth has long been destroyed, so he can only rely on his own scattered idea of the past. Much of the first half of the book follows Winston's desperate attempts to find out what life in Oceania was like before the party's rise to power. He questions one of the elderly proles about this, but all he can remember are irrelevant details, and even that is hazy. Try as he might, Winston just cannot get an idea of either his history or the history of his society. He has some vague idea of who his mother and sister were before they were disappeared by Big Brother, but that too is a blur. He can't even be certain of what happened a single day in the past, because the records of the party are constantly being altered. Big Brother might deliver a speech, only for its contents to be changed on all official documentation the very next day. It was dangerous to even speak to a colleague about past events, because they might say something that contradicted the party line, and be vaporized as a result. That is, arrested, tortured, killed, and wiped from all official records, as if they had never existed. Unpersonal. All of this means that Winston and the rest of the populace live in a state of perpetual confusion. They see reality as if it's through a thick fog. They can't be sure if their memories are correct or if they're slowly going mad, or, horror of all horrors, that the party has made a mistake. It is gaslighting on a monumental scale, and it means no one can pin down a consistent idea of what is true. Aristotle once famously claimed that if a proposition is true, it is true for all time. If John went shopping on the 11th of March 1996 is true today, then it is true forever. No one can change it. But in the world of 1984, such an idea is ridiculous. The past alters at the whim of the party higher-ups, and since there's no one around to contradict them, their narrative wins by default. After all, we normally check what happened in the past by looking at the evidence, but all of the evidence here is centrally controlled. Hence the party saying, who controls the present controls the past. But if we take John Locke's theory of identity seriously, then the situation is actually much worse than this. It is not just that Winston cannot make sense of the past, he can't even make sense of himself. His memories have to change along with party policy. If he talked to someone yesterday who has since been unpersoned, then that recollection can only be maintained on pain of death. In Lockean terminology, he has, to a certain extent, become a different person. Worse still, he is constantly becoming different people each and every day. With each memory encroached upon by Big Brother, he loses a little sliver of his personal identity, sacrificing it at the altar of the state, only to have to do the same thing the next day, crafting new memories to replace the ones that are now criminal. Of course, like almost everything else in the novel, this confusion is by the design of the party. If the populace can't even decide on the past, then they'll have no idea what to do about the future. They cannot even spot causal relationships in the world. The ability to observe trends, discover weaknesses in the party apparatus, and assert their own view of reality is completely taken away. One of the famous slogans of the party is, "Ignorance is strength." But it is more than just that. Their strength comes not just from the ignorance of the population, but from their sheer bafflement as they spin out of control, alienated from themselves and from reality, forced to question the evidence of their own senses against mountains of artificially constructed documents. A hole opens up in their minds. They begin to crave answers, to have any small crumb of certainty in their model of the world. And this is something the party is all too eager to provide. This is what I take to be the first brick in both the wall of Big Brother's power and the misery of Oceania. The party presents its subjects with an impossible choice. Either submit to the state's view of the past, sacrificing their very identities in the process, or give in to a whirlwind of bewilderment that will prevent them from resisting in any case. Here we see the emergence of a theme that will become central to our analysis. The party constructs reality, so there are truly no good options. But the least bad of the bunch is always to toe their destructive line. But this is only one aspect of the party's vice-like grip on the minds of its populace. And there is far worse yet to come. 3. Language and thought. If you had never known the word elephant, how would you talk about them? You might describe them by their properties. But what if I then took away the words for trunk, or big flappy ear, or grey? You might still be able to get your thought across, but it would be much, much more difficult. If I continued this process for long enough, it would be almost impossible to come up with sensible ideas about elephants. Our thoughts often follow the same contours that language carves out for them. And what we can speak about has a huge bearing on what we can think about. The neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett has applied this insight to emotions, looking at how our concepts of our feelings shape how we then subsequently feel. So if we have a given idea of happy and we ascribe it to ourselves, then that will actually affect our mood, and so on. Arguably, part of the value of things like existential philosophy is giving voice to extreme or difficult emotions we might otherwise be unable to make sense of. So it is telling that one of the party's main aims in 1984 is to limit the language that the inhabitants of Oceania could use, so that, in turn, they can limit their thoughts. One way they do this is just by punishing dissident speech by torture and death, but everyone knows about that. I want to talk about the subtler, more insidious way that Big Brother captures the mind. I want to talk about Newspeak. Newspeak is the official language of Oceania, and its vocabulary is entirely controlled by the party. In our world, languages can roughly evolve through a process akin to supply and demand. People want to express something, but they cannot.
Terrifying ideology of 1984. No. Well, let me go do that and then I'll be back. Ooh, coffee there. Meow, meow. Cosita there. Ya no, tú. Así, ¿verdad? Tú.
Does only make it worse.
Señor. Sí, ¿verdad? Ay, güey. Yeah, let's do this one. The complete Fun to Imagine with Richard. Fun to Imagine. I know lo estoy confundiendo, but still, let's watch that.
It's interesting that some people find science so easy and others find it kind of dull and difficult. Especially kids, some of them are just eat it up. And I don't know why it is. It's the same perhaps for all subjects. For instance, lots of people love music and I never could carry a tune. And I lose a great deal of pleasure out of that. And I think people lose a lot of pleasure who find science dull. In the case of science, I think that one of the things that make it very difficult is it takes a lot of imagination. It's very hard to imagine all the crazy things that things really are like.
Sí quiero, pero ahorita voy.
Nothing's really as it seems. We're used to get, hot and cold, and all that hot and cold is the speeds that the atoms are jiggling. If they jiggle more, it corresponds to hotter, and colder is jiggling less. So if you have a bunch of atoms, a cup of coffee or something sitting on a table, and the atoms are jiggling a great deal in the coffee, and they bounce against the cup, and the cup then gets shaking, and the atoms in the cup shake, and they bounce against the saucer, and the heat heats the cup and heats everything else. And hot thing spreads its heat into other things by mere contact, because the atoms that are jiggling a lot in the hot thing shake the ones that are jiggling only a little bit in the cold thing, so that the hot heat, we say, goes into the cold thing. It spreads. But what's spreading is just jiggle and irregular motions, which is easy to kind of understand. It brings up another thing that's kind of curious. That I say that things jiggle, and if you're used to balls bouncing, they slow up and stop after a while. But we have to imagine with the atoms a perfect elasticity. They never lose any energy. Every time they bounce, they keep on bouncing all the time. They don't lose anything. They're perpetually moving. And that the things that happen when we say something loses energy, if a ball comes down and bounces, it shakes irregularly some of the atoms in the floor. And then when it comes up again, it leaves some of those atoms moving, jiggling. So as it bounces, it's passing its extra energies, its extra motions, to little patches on the floor each time it bounces, and loses a little each time, until it settles down, we say, as if all the motion has stopped. But what's left is the floor is shaking more than it was before, and the atoms in the ball are shaking more than they were before. That the organized motion of all these atoms moving the same way, falling down, and the quiet floor is now transformed into a ball sitting on the ground, But all that emotion is still there in a form, or the energy of motion, in the form of the jiggling of the floor, which is a little bit warmer. Unbelievable. But anybody who's hammered a great deal on something knows that it's true, that if you pound something and hit it a lot, you can feel the temperature difference. It heats up. It heats up simply because you're jiggling it. This picture of atoms is a beautiful one that you can keep looking at all kinds of things this way. You see a little drop of water, a tiny drop. And the atoms attract each other. They like to be next to each other. They want as many partners as they can get. Now, the guys that are at the surface have only partners on one side here, in the air on the other side, so they're trying to get in. And you can imagine this team of people, these teeming people, all moving very fast, all trying to have as many partners as possible. And the guys at the edge are very unhappy and nervous, and they keep pounding in, trying to get in, and that makes it a tight ball instead of a flat. And that's what, surface tension, the way when you realize, when you see how sometimes the water drop sits like this on a table, then you start to imagine why it sits like that, because everybody's trying to get into the water. And at the same time, while all this is happening, there are these atoms that are leaving the surface, and the water drop is slowly disappearing. I find myself trying to imagine all kinds of things all the time, and I get a kick out of it, just like a runner gets a kick out of sweating. I get a kick out of thinking about these things. I can't stop. I mean, I can talk forever. If you cooled off the water so the jiggling is less and less, and it jiggles slower and slower, then the atoms get stuck in place. They like to be with their friend. There's a force of attraction, and they get packed together. They're not rolling over each other. They're in a nice pattern, like oranges in a crate, in a nice organized pattern, all just jiggling in place, but not having enough motion to get loose of their own place and to break the structure down. And that's what I'm describing as a solid. It's ice. It has a structure. If you held the atoms at one end in a certain position, all the rest are lined up in a position sticking out, and it's solid at the end. Whereas if you heat that harder, then they begin to get loose and roll all over each other, and that's the liquid. And if you heat that still harder and they bounce harder, then they simply bounce apart from each other, and they're just individual, I say atoms, there's really little groups of atoms, molecules, which come flying and hit. And although they have a tendency to stick, they're moving too fast. Their hands don't grab, so to speak, as they pass, and they fly apart again. And this is the gas we call steam. You can get all kinds of understanding. When I was a kid with this air, which I was always interested in, I've noticed that when I pumped up my tires in a bicycle, you can learn a lot by having a bicycle. I'd pump up the tires, that the pump would get hot. And that also understandable. See, as the pump handle comes down and the atoms are coming up against it and bouncing off, and it's moving in, the ones that are coming off have a bigger speed than the ones that are coming in, so that as it comes down, and each time they collide, it speeds them up. And so they're hotter. When you compress the gas, it heats. And when you pull the piston back out, then atoms which are coming fast at the piston feel a receding, or a sort of a give. It gives, and it comes out with less energy. It's like going up against something which is soft and yielding. It goes boom, boom, and it loses. So as you pull the piston out and the atoms are hit, they lose their speed and they cool off. And gases are cool when they expand. And the fun of it is that all these things which you see or notice in the world about it, the pump heats the gas, or the gas cools when it expands, or the steam evaporates until you cover the cover. And all these things you can understand from these simple pictures. And that's kind of a lot of fun to think about. I don't want to take this stuff seriously. I think we should just have fun imagining it, not worry about. There's no teacher going to ask you questions at the end. Otherwise, it's a horrible subject. The atoms like each other, the different degrees. Oxygen, for instance, in the air would like to be next to carbon, and if they're getting near each other, they snap together. If
Why?
they're not too
That
close, though, they repel and they go apart, so they don't know that they could snap together. It's just as if you had a ball that was trying to climb a hill and there was a hole it could go into, like a volcano hole, a deep one. It's rolling along, it doesn't go down in the deep hole because if it starts to climb the hill and then rolls away again. But if you made it go fast enough, it'll fall into the hole. And so if you have something like wood in oxygen, there's carbon in the wood from a tree, and the oxygen comes and hits it, carbon, but not hard enough. It just goes away again. The air is always coming, nothing's happening. If you can get it faster, by heating it up somehow, somewhere, somehow, get it started, a few of them come fast, they go over the top, so to speak. They come close enough to the carbon and snap in. And that gives a lot of jiggly motion, which might hit some other atoms, making those go faster so they can climb up and bump against other carbon atoms, and they jiggle, and they make mothers jiggle, and you get a terrible catastrophe, which is one after the other. All these things are going faster and faster and snapping in, and the whole thing is changing. That catastrophe is a fire. It's just a way of looking at it, and these things are happening. They're perpetual. Once it gets started, it keeps on going. The heat makes the other atoms capable of reaching to make more heat, to make other atoms, and so on. So this terrible snapping is producing a lot of jiggling. And if I put, with all that activity of the atoms there, and I put a cup of coffee over that mess of wood that's doing this, it's going to get a lot of jiggling. So that's what the heat of the fire is. And then, of course, if you see, this is what happens when you start to think. You just go on and on. You wonder where. How did it get started? Why is it that the wood's been sitting around all this time with the oxygen all this time, and it didn't do this earlier or something? Where did I get this from? Well, it came from a tree. And the substance of a tree is carbon. And where did that come from? That comes from the air. It's carbon dioxide from the air. People look at trees and they think it comes out of the ground. The plants grow out of the ground. But if you ask where the substance comes from, you find out, where do they come from? The trees come out of the air? They surely come out of the air. No, they come out of the air. The carbon dioxide in the air goes into the tree, and it changes it, kicking out the oxygen, and pushing the oxygen away from the carbon, and leaving the carbon substance with water. Water comes out of the ground, you see. Only how did it get in there? It came out of the air, didn't it? It came down from the sky. So in fact, most of a tree, almost all of a tree is out of the ground. I'm sorry, it's out of the air. There's a little bit from the ground, some minerals and so forth. Now, of course, I told you the oxygen, we know the oxygen and carbon stick together very tight. How is it the tree is so smart as to manage to take the carbon dioxide, which is the carbon and oxygen nicely combined, and undo that so easy? Ah, life. Life has some mysterious force. No, the sun is shining. And it's the sunlight that comes down and knocks this oxygen away from the carbon. So it takes sunlight to get the plant to work. And so the sun all the time is doing the work of separating the oxygen away from the carbon. The oxygen is some kind of terrible byproduct, which it spits back into the air, and leaving the carbon and water and stuff to make the substance of the tree. Then when we take the substance of the tree and stick it in the fireplace, and there's all the oxygen made by these trees, and all the carbon would much prefer to be close together again. And once you let the heat to get it started, it continues and makes an awful lot of activity while it's going back together again. And all this nice light and everything comes out, and everything is being undone. You're going back from carbon and oxygen back to carbon dioxide. And the light and heat that's coming out, that's the light and heat of the sun that went in. So it's sort of stored sun that's coming out when you burn it. A log. Next question. How is it the sun is so jiggly, so hot? I gotta stop somewhere. I'll leave you something to imagine. Most elastic things like steel springs and so on is nothing but this electrical thing pulling back. You pull the atoms a little bit apart when you bend something. and then they try to come back together again. But rubber bands work on a different principle. There's some long molecules like chains and other little ones that are shaking all the time that are bombarding them, these chains. And the chains are all kind of kinky and knocked about and shake. When you pull open the rubber band, the strings get straighter. But these strings are being bombarded on the side by these other atoms trying to shorten them by kinking them. So it pulls back. It's trying to pull back, and it's pulling back only because of the heat. So if you heat a rubber band, it'll pull more strongly. For instance, if you hang a weight with a rubber band and put a little match to it, it's kind of fun to watch it rise, the way it heats more. And there's another thing you can check that this idea is right, that it's heat that drives a rubber band. If you pull the band out, just like when we push the piston in the gas, if you pull the band out, the tightening string hitting those molecules makes them move faster, and so it's warmer. And if you take the band and let it in, then the molecules hitting the strings which sort of give as the thing hits, they give in to the soft like, and they lose energy when they hit these retiring string. So it cools. And there is a little way you can do this. You're not very sensitive. It's a small effect. And if you take a fairly wide rubber band and put it between your lips and pull it out, you'll certainly notice it's hotter. And if you then hold it out and let it in, you'll notice it's cooler. At least you'll notice a certain difference in what happens when you expand it, when you contract it. And I've always found rubber bands fascinating to think that when they're sitting on an old package of papers for a long time, holding those papers together, it's done by a perpetual pounding of the atoms against these chains to hold it, trying to kink them year after year. Well, rubber bands don't last that long, but anyhow, for a long time, trying to hold this whole thing together. The world is a dynamic mess of jiggling things if you look at it right. And if you magnify it, you can hardly see anything anymore because everything's jiggling and they're all in patterns and they're all lots of little balls. And it's lucky that we have such a large-scale view of everything that we can see them as things without having to worry about all these little atoms all the time.
Keep middle of a jump, 50, 6 left of a jump long, tightens of a crest jump.
That's so
If you get hold of two magnets and you push them, you can feel this pushing between them. Turn it around the other way and they slam together. Now, what is it, the feeling between those two magnets?
What do you mean, what's the feeling between the two magnets?
There's something there, isn't there? I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now, what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's
to
a
ask.
reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? For example, Aunt Minnie is in a hospital. Why? Because she went out and she slipped on the ice and broke her hip. That satisfies people. It satisfies, but it wouldn't satisfy someone who came from another planet, knew nothing about things. First, you should understand why, when you break your hip, do you go to the hospital? How do you get to the hospital when the hip was broken? Well, because her husband, seeing that she had the hip was broken, called the hospital up and sent somebody to get her. All that is understood by people. Now, when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking why. Why did the husband call up the hospital? Because husband is interested in his wife's welfare. Not always. Some husbands aren't interested in their wife's welfare when they're drunk and they're angry. And so you begin to get a very interesting understanding of the world and all its complications. In order to if you try to follow anything up, you go deeper and deeper in various directions. For example, you can go, why did she slip on the ice? Well, ice is slippery. Everybody knows that, no problem. But you ask, why is ice slippery? That's kind of curious. Ice is extremely slippery. It's very interesting. You say, how does it work? You could, you see, so you could either say, I'm satisfied that you've answered me, ice is slippery, that explains it. Or you could go on and say, why is ice slippery? And then you're involved with something, because there aren't many things as slippery as ice. It's very hard to get. Greasy stuff, but that's sort of wet and slimy. But a solid that's so slippery, because it is in the case of ice that when you stand on it, they say, momentarily the pressure melts the ice a little bit, so you got a sort of instantaneous water surface on which you're slipping. Why on ice and not on other things? Because ice expands water expands when it freezes, so the pressure tries to undo the expansion and melts it. It's capable of melting it. But other substances contract when they're freezing, and when you push them, they're just satisfied to be solid. Why does water expand when it freezes and other substances don't expand when they freeze? All right? I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult the why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. You'll notice in this example that the more I ask why, it gets interesting after all. That's my idea, that the deeper a thing is, the more interesting it is. And we could even go further and say, why did she fall down when she slipped? That has to do with gravity. It involves in all the planets and everything else. Never mind. It goes on and on. Now, when you ask, for example, why two magnets repel, there are many different levels. It depends on whether you're a student of physics or an ordinary person who doesn't know anything or not. If you're somebody who doesn't know anything at all about it, all I can say is that there's a magnetic force that makes them repel, and that you're feeling that force. And you say, but that's very strange, because I don't feel kind of force like that in other circumstances. When you turn them the other way, they attract. There's a very analogous force, electrical force, which is the same kind of a question. And you say, that's also very weird. But you're not at all disturbed by the fact that when you put your hand on the chair, it pushes you back. But we found out by looking at it that that's the same force, as a matter of fact, the electrical force, not magnetic exactly in that case, but it's the same electrical repulsions that are involved in keeping your finger away from the chair, because everything's made out of its electrical forces in minor and microscopic details. There's other forces involved, but it's connected to electrical forces. It turns out that the magnetic and the electric force with which I wish to explain these things, this repulsion in the first place, is what ultimately is the deeper thing that we have to start, what we can start with, to explain many other things that looked like they were, everybody would just accept them. You know, you can't put your hand through the chair, that's taken for granted. But that you can't put your hand through the chair when looked at more closely, why? It involves these same repulsive forces that appear in magnets. The situation you then have to explain is why in magnets it goes over a bigger distance than in ordinarily. And there it has to do with the fact that in iron, all the electrons are spinning in the same direction. They all get lined up, and they magnify the effect of the force until it's large enough at a distance that you can feel it. But it's a force which is present all the time and very common, and is in a basic force of almost, I mean, I can go a little further back if I were more technical, but at an early level, I just have to tell you that's going to be one of the things you'll just have to take as an element in the world, the existence of magnetic repulsion, or electrical attraction, magnetic attraction. I can't explain that attraction in terms of anything else that's familiar to you. For example, if we say the magnets attract like as if they were connected by rubber bands, I would be cheating you. Because they're not connected by rubber bands, I shouldn't be in trouble. You'd soon ask me about the nature of the band. And secondly, if you were curious enough, you'd ask me why rubber bands tend to pull back together again, and I would end up explaining that in terms of electrical forces, which are the very things that I'm trying to use the rubber bands to explain, so I have cheated very badly, you see. So I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to why magnets attract each other, except to tell you that they do. And to tell you that that's one of the elements in the world of different kinds of forces. There are electrical forces, magnetic forces, gravitational forces, and others. And those are some of the parts. If you were a student, you'd go further. I could go further. I could tell you that the magnetic forces are related to the electrical forces very intimately. That our relationship between the gravity forces and electrical forces remains unknown. And so on. But I really can't do a good job, any job, of explaining magnetic force in terms of something else that you're more familiar with, because I don't understand it in terms of anything else that you're more familiar with.
Junction 30. 4 right, narrow over crest. Don't cut 5 left. Open
This stuff of fantasizing and looking at the world, imagining things, it really isn't fantasizing because you're only trying to imagine the way it really is. It comes in handy sometimes. The other day I was at the dentist and he's getting ready with his electric drill to make holes. And I thought I better think of something fast or else it's going to hurt. And then I thought about this little motor going around and what was it that made it turn? And what was going on? And what's going on is there's a dam some distance away here and water going over the dam turns a great big wheel, right? And this wheel is connected with long, thin pieces of copper, which split up into other pieces of copper and split up and spread all over the city. And then they're connected back through another little gadget that makes wheels turn. All the wheels of the city are turning because this thing turns. If this thing stops, all the wheels stop. It starts again, they all start again. And I think that's kind of a marvelous thing of nature. It's extremely curious. That phenomenon, I like to think about a lot, because all it is copper and iron. See, sometimes we think it's a man-made generator, it's very complicated, the phenomenon is a result of some special something that we made. But it's nature doing it, and it's just iron and copper. And if you took a big long loop of copper and had iron at each end and moved the piece of iron here, the other iron moves at the other piece. And if you get it down to the nothing, just moving a piece of iron in a loop of copper and seeing another piece of iron move, you realize what a fantastic mystery nature is. You don't even need the iron. You could, if you at least get this pump primed and started, by jiggling copper strands around fast enough, knotting them and unknotting them and so forth, you can get other copper strands to move at the other end of a long connection. And what is it? It's only copper and motion. And we're so used to circumstances in which these electrical phenomena are all canceled out. Everything's sort of neutral. Pushing and pulling is really very dull. But nature has these wonderful things, magnetic forces and electrical forces. You comb your hair with your comb and you get some strange condition. So you put it in front of a piece of paper and it lifts up the paper, or the paper jiggles at a distance, far away. Yeah. And that's, in fact, turns out that is the thing that's more deeper inside of everything than the things we're used to. We're used to forces that only act directly, right? You push with your finger, it only acts directly. But then you have to imagine what it is that's pushing with the finger. Here's this little finger's made out of little balls and atoms. And it's got another bunch of atoms that I'm pushing. And there's a little space between those atoms. And this pushing is going through that space. And the only thing that happens with the comb and the paper is that circumstances have arisen which make it possible to see that these forces go through a bigger distance than just the short distance between the atoms. What it is that you have charges like electrons that are both the same. They repel each other with a force. They're little tiny particles. They're a piece of the atom, and they repel each other with a force which is enormous. It's inversely as the square of the distance, just like gravity is inversely as the square of the distance, but gravity is attractive, and this is repulsive. And for two electrons, the gravity is so weak compared to the electricity. Electricity is so much more enormous than the gravity. I can't express it because I don't know the name of the number. It's 1 with 30 or 8 or 40 zeros after the 1. Bigger is electricity. It's so enormous that if I were all electrons, well, the numbers are too big. So, if there's also, however, for electrical things, other kind of charge, positive charges. An example of protons are positive. They're inside the nucleus of the atom, and they attract electrons. Opposite charges attract, and like charges repel. So you have to imagine enormous forces where likes are trying to get away from likes, and unlikes are trying to get near The opposite. What would happen if you had a lot of them? They'd be, all the likes would collect with unlikes. They attract each other. And they'd get an intimate mixture of pluses and minuses all on top of each other, very close together. You wouldn't have a lot of pluses anywhere because they repel each other. They'll all be compensated by minuses very close. And you get these little knots of plus and minus. The reason that the knots don't get smaller and smaller is because they are particles and there's got quantum mechanical effects that we won't discuss that makes it that you can't get any smaller than a certain size. And so you get these little lumps, which are balls. They're the atoms. The atoms have positive and negative charge, and they're neutralized. They cancel their charge as nearly as they can. And because of this force is so big, it ends up nowhere, with very little left. Because it's so big, it cancels out. There's always so exactly the same pluses and minuses in any normal material. When you comb your hair, it rubs just a little bit extra, or just a few extra minuses, say here, and somewhere else a few extra pluses. But the forces are so big, there's just the extra ones, which make a force that we can see that seems to be at a long range. And that we find mysterious, and that we need an explanation for. And we try to find an explanation for it in terms of ideas like the forces that are inside of rubber bands or steel bars or twisted things. We would like to have some kind of puller at a distance because we're used to it, that we don't get any push until we're touching. But the fact is that the reason we don't get any push until we're touching is it's the same force as you see at a long distance, only it's come down to short because the pluses and minuses have canceled out so well that you don't feel anything until it gets very, very close. When it gets close enough, of course, it makes a difference which is plus and which is minus and where they are, and they repel each other. So it's kind of fun to imagine this intimate mixture of highly attractive opposites, which are so strong that they cancel out the effects. And it's only sometimes, when you have an excess of one kind and another, that you get this mysterious electrical force. And how can I explain a mysterious electrical force in any other way? Why should I try to explain it in terms of of something like jelly or other things which are made, and I understand the other way around in terms of strong long-distance forces which have all canceled out. So it's the electrical forces, in fact, and the magnetic forces, in fact, that we have to accept as the base reality in which we're going to explain all the other things. So again, it turns out it's hard to understand. You have to do a lot of imagining. That the real world has as its base a force which acts at a long distance. That we haven't got much experience with that force. We have a peculiar phenomena here and there, but ordinarily we don't have much experience with that force is simply because that's what requires explanation. That's what requires imagination. The long-distance force we have no other picture for. And then the example of the generator. What happens is that the electrons, which are a part of an atom, they're pushed by the motion of the copper wires. And it's wonderful to think that you push a few here, and they get too close together, so they push the others because they repel at a long distance. So it's not just like water, which repels at a short distance, but it's a wonderful fluid which repels at a long distance, and the effects therefore can go very quickly through the wire. If there's a little concentration, you go zing through the wire all over the city at once. And electrical, you can use that stuff to make signals. You can push a few electrons here and there by talking in a telephone at the other end of the line. A long line of copper across the city. The electrons respond because of this very rapid interaction over these long distances to what you're saying in this room. And that they've discovered experimentally the existence of these long forces and these rapid motion actions and so forth was a tremendous thing for human beings. I think that the discovery of electricity and magnetism and the electromagnetic effects, which were finally worked out, the full equations for everything was worked out by Maxwell in 1873, is probably the most fundamental transformation of the most remarkable thing in history, the biggest change in history.
Into 3 right of a crest bump. Into 4 left long, into turn 1 right.
I went to a scientific school, MIT, and then fraternity when you first join. They try to keep you from being, if you think you're smart, from being feeling that you're too smart, by giving you what look like simple questions to try to figure out what actually happens. And it's like training for imagination. You know? It's kind of fun, and I thought I'd tell you some of them that I remember. I learned them. Of course, once you learn them, the next time somebody comes along with this wonderful puzzle, you look at them kind of quietly. You wait 2 or 3 seconds or 5 seconds to show that you were thinking, and then you come up with this answer to astonish your friends. But the fact was, of course, that you were trained by your fraternity brothers as to how to answer these things early on. One of the questions we got was the problem about the mirror. It's an old problem. You look in a mirror, and let's say you part your hair on the right side. Then you look in the mirror, and the image has got its hair part on the left side. So the image is left to right mixed up. It's not top and bottom mixed up, because the top of the head of the image is up there at the top, and the bottom of the feet are at the bottom. And the question is, how does a mirror know to get the left and right mixed up and not the up and down? You get a better idea of the problem if you think of lying down and looking at the mirror. All right, your hair is still on the left side, and now the left and right was the up and down, whereas the up and down, which look okay, was the right and left before. And the mirror somehow figured out what you're going to do when you're looking at it. So to describe in a sort of symmetrical way what a mirror does, that it doesn't look lopsided, that it takes left and mixes it up with right, and it doesn't do the same with up and down. And after a lot of fiddling, I knew we worked out the answer to that one. See, if you wave this hand, then the hand in the mirror that waves is right opposite it. The hand on the east is the hand on the east, and the hand on the west is the hand on the west, and the head that's up is up, and the feet that are down are down. Everything's really all right. But what's wrong is if this is north, your nose is to the north of the back of your head, but in the image, the nose is to the south of the back of the head. So what happens really in the image is neither the right nor left mixed up with the top and bottom, but the front and back have been reversed. You see, that which is the nose on the thing is on the wrong side of the head, if you want to. All right? Now, ordinarily, when we think of the image, we think of it as another person. And we think of the normal way that a person would get into that condition over there. It's a psychological thing. We don't think of the idea that the person has been squashed and pushed backwards, forwards with his nose and his head, because that's not what ordinarily happens to people. A person gets to look like he looks in a mirror by walking around and facing you. And because people, when they walk around, don't turn their head for their feet, we leave that part alone. But they get their right and left hands swung about, you see, when they turn around. And so we say that it's left and right interchanged. But really, the symmetrical way, it's along the axis of the mirror that things get interchanged. Well, that's kind of an easy one. A harder one, and very entertaining, was what keeps a train on the track? And of course the answer is, as everyone thinks, the flanges on the wheels. You know, the wheels have some kind of flange on them. But that's not the answer. Those flanges are just safety devices. If the flanges rub against the tracks, you hear a terrible squealing. They're just in case the real mechanism doesn't work. There's another problem with trains that's connected to it. People all know this about their automobile, that when you go around a corner, the outside wheels have to go further than the inside wheels. And if the wheels were connected on a solid shaft, you couldn't do that. You can't turn the outside wheels further than the inside wheels. And so the shaft is broken in the middle with a gear system which is called a differential. Did you ever see the differential on a railroad train? No, you look at those wheels under a freight car, and there are the two wheels, and there's a solid steel rod going from one wheel to the other. There's nothing. One turns the same as the other. So now how does it go around a corner, a curve, when the outside wheel has to go further than the inside wheel? And the answer is that the wheels are flanged like this. I mean, not flanged, they're cones. This way. That is, they're a little fatter, closer to the train, and a little thinner further out. If you look closely, you'll see they got this beveled edge. And it's all very simple. When they go around a curve, they slide out on the track a bit, so that this wheel travels on a fatter part, a bigger diameter, and this on a smaller diameter. So when they both turn one turn, this swings further than the other. And that's what keeps it on the track also the same way. Suppose a train's running along on this thing, on the track, and the track's here and here, and the two wheels are exactly balanced, and it's nice and even. Suppose accidentally it gets a bump or something and slides out this way. Then this wheel is on a bigger circumference than this one, but they're on a solid shaft. So when it turns once around, it carries this wheel forward relative to the other and steers the train back on the track. Of course, if it gets too far off on the other side, it goes back and forth, and it stays on the track because the wheels are tapered and the flanges are safety. Well, we had a lot of stuff like that we had to learn, that would get straightened out before we could become full-fledged members of the fraternity.
Extra long to keep middle over 170.
If I'm sitting next to a swimming pool, somebody dives in, and she's not too pretty, so I can think of something else. I think of the waves and things that have formed in the water. And when there's lots of people have dived in the pool, there's a very great choppiness of all these waves all over the water. And to think that it's possible, maybe, that in those waves is a clue as to what's happening in the pool. That some sort of insect or something with sufficient cleverness could sit in the corner of the pool and just be disturbed by the waves, and by the nature of the irregularities and bumping of the waves, have figured out who jumped in, where and when, and what's happening all over the pool. And that's what we're doing when we're looking at something. The light that comes out is waves, just like in the swimming pool, except in 3 dimensions instead of the 2 dimensions of the pool as they're going in all directions. And we have a 1/8 of an inch black hole into which these things go, which is particularly sensitive to the parts of the waves that are coming in a particular direction. It's not particularly sensitive when they're coming in at the wrong angle, which we say is from the corner of our eye. And if we want to get more information in the corner of our eye, we swivel this ball about so that the hole moves from place to place. Then it's quite wonderful that we can figure out so easy. That's really because the light waves are easier than the waves in the water are a little bit more complicated. It would have been harder for the bug than for us, but it's the same idea, to figure out what the thing is that we're looking at a distance. And it's kind of incredible because when I'm looking at you, someone standing to my left can see somebody who's standing at my right. That is, the light could be going right across this way, the waves are going this way, the waves are going this way, the waves are going this way. It's just a complete network. Now, it's easy to think of them as arrows passing each other, but that's not the way it is, because all it is something shaking. It's called the electric field, but we don't have to bother with what it is. It's just like the water height is going up and down. So there's some quantities shaking about here, and in a combination of motions that's so elaborate and complicated that that result is to produce an influence which makes me see you, at the same time completely undisturbed by the fact that there are influences that represent the other guy seeing him on this side. So that there's this tremendous mess of waves all over in space, which is the light bouncing around the room and going from one thing to the other. Because, of course, most of the room doesn't have 1/8 inch black holes. It's not interested in that light, but the light's there anyway. I mean, it bounces off this and it bounces off that, and all this is going on, and yet we can sort it out with this instrument. But beside all that, you see, those waves that I was talking about in the water, maybe they're so big, some of them, and then you could have slower swashes, which are longer and shorter. And perhaps our animal who's making his study is only using waves between this length and that length. So it turns out that the eye is only using waves between this length and that length, except those 2 lengths are 100 thousandths of an inch. 100 thousandths of an inch, Pete. And what about the slower swashes, the waves that go more slowly, that have a longer distance from crest to trough? Those represent heat. We feel those, but our eye doesn't see them focused very well. We don't, in fact, at all. The shorter waves are blue, the light, and the longer waves are red. But when it gets longer than that, we call it infrared. All this is in there at the same time. That's the heat. Pit vipers that you got down here in the desert, they have a little thing that they can see the longer waves and pick out mice which are radiating their heat, their longer waves, by their body heat, by looking at them with this eye, which is the pit of the pit viper. But we aren't able to do that. And then these waves get longer and longer, and all through the same space. All these things are going on at the same time, so that in this space, there's not only my vision of you, but information from Moscow radio that's being broadcast at the present moment, and the singing of somebody from Peru. All the radio waves are just the same kind of waves, only longer waves. And there's the radar from the airplane, which is looking at the ground to figure out where it is, which is coming through this room at the same time. Plus the X-rays, cosmic rays, and all these other things, which are the same kind of waves, exactly the same waves, but shorter, faster, or longer, slower. It's exactly the same thing. So this big field, this area of irregular motions of this electric field, this vibration, contains this tremendous information, and it's all really there. That's what gets you. If you don't believe it, then you pick a piece of wire and connect it to a box. And in the wire, the electrons will be pushed back and forth by this electric field, sloshing just at the right speed for a certain kind of long waves. And you turn some knobs on the box to get the sloshing just right, and you hear Radio Moscow. Though you know that it was there. How else did it get there? It was there all the time. It's only when you turn on the radio that you notice it. But that all these things are going through the room at the same time, which everybody knows but you gotta stop and think about it to really get the pleasure about the complexity, the inconceivable nature of nature. When we were talking about the atoms, one of the trouble that people have with the atoms is that they're so tiny and it's so hard to imagine the scale. That the size of the atoms are, in size, compared to an apple, is the same scale as an apple is to the size of the Earth. And that's a kind of a hard thing to take. And you have to go through all these things all the time. And people find these numbers inconceivable. And I do too. And the only thing you do is you just change your scale. I mean, you're just thinking of small balls, but you don't try to think of exactly how small they are too often, or you get kind of a bit nutty, all right? But in astronomy, you have the same thing in reverse, because the distances to these stars are so enormous. You know that light goes so fast that it only takes a few seconds to go to the moon and back, or it goes around the Earth 7.5 times in a second. And it goes for a year, 2 years, 3 years before it gets to the nearest other star that there is to us. But all our stars are the stars that are nearby in a great galaxy, a big mass of stars, which is called a galaxy, a group. But our galaxy is, what is it, something 100,000 light years, like 100,000 years. And then there's another patch of stars. It takes 1 million years for the light to get here, going at this enormous rate. And you just go crazy trying to make too real that distance. You have to do everything in proportion. It's easy to say the galaxies are little patches of stars, and they're 10 times as far apart as they are big. Well, that's an easy picture. Gets it. But you just go to a different scale. That's easier. And once in a while, you try to come back to Earth scale to discuss the galaxies. But it's kind of hard. The number of stars that we see at night is only about 5,000. But the number of stars in our galaxy, the telescopes have shown when you improve the instrument. We look at a galaxy, we look at the stars, all the light that we see, the little tiny influence, spreads from the star over this enormous distance of 3 light years for the nearest star. On, this light from the star is spreading. The wavefronts are getting wider and wider, weaker and weaker out into all of space, and finally the tiny fraction of it comes in 1 square, eighth of an inch, tiny little black hole, and does something to me, so I know it's there. Well, to know a little bit more about it, I'd rather gather a little more of this tiny fraction of this front of light. And so I make a big telescope, which is a kind of funnel. The light that comes over this big area, 200 inches across, is very carefully organized, so it's all concentrated back so it can go through a pupil. Actually, it's better to photograph it, or nowadays to use photocells, they're a better instrument. But anyway, the idea of the telescope is to focus the light from a bigger area into a smaller area so that we see things that are weaker, less light. And in that way, we find there's a very large number of stars in the galaxy. There's so many that if you tried to name them, 1 a second, naming all the stars in our galaxy, I mean all the stars in the universe, just this galaxy here, it takes 3,000 years. And yet that's not a very big number. Because if those stars were to drop $1 bill on the Earth during a year, each star dropping $1 bill, they might take care of the deficit which is suggested for the budget of the United States. So you see what kind of numbers we have to deal with. At any rate, I think that the numbers are a problem in astronomy, the sizes and numbers, and the best thing to do is to relax and enjoy the tininess of us and the enormity of the rest of the universe. Of course, if you're feeling depressed by that, you can always look at it the other way and think of how big you are compared to the atoms and the parts of atoms, and then you're an enormous universe to those atoms, so you can sort of stand in the middle and enjoy everything both ways. But the great part of astronomy is the imagination that's been necessary to guess what kinds of structures, what kinds of things can be happening to produce the light and the effects of the light and so on of the stars that we do see. And I could take an example, an historical example. See it many times in science. By using imagination, you've imagined something which could be, according to all the known knowledge of the laws, and you don't know whether it is yet or not. And that's very interesting. There's a creative imagination, you like to call it, not just imagining things that are relatively easy, but something different. And to take an example of a star, as we understand it, the ordinary star like the sun is a great big ball of gas, of hydrogen. It's burning up the hydrogen and so forth, and it's an enormous mass of gas. And it's held together by gravity. You don't have to always understand gravity as curved space. It's good enough for this purpose that force inversely is square of the distance. When things are closer together, the force is stronger. And it pulls everything together. By the way, that's why the world is round. Because the globe of Earth is pulled together as much as possible, and if it had a great mountain and an irregularity of a bump or something, it would be pulled in by gravity and it all gets smooth. Rocks aren't strong enough to hold a bump much bigger than a few miles, and Mount Everest is our biggest bump. But on the moon, where the gravity's less, the bumps are higher, the mountains are bigger on the moon. Anyway, to get back to the star, it's all held together by gravity, and it's got a nuclear fuel, which we haven't been talking about, that's burning up the hydrogen and generating energy, which keeps things going. And after a while, it would use the fuel up. People began to think about what would happen then. And it would be possible to just be gas sort of hanging around, held together by gravity, but quiet. But another possibility was to think, if I push the stuff together closer, the gravity is stronger. Would it hold together? Well, if you push a little bit together, the pressure increases. When you push the gas together, there are more atoms and they pound harder, so the pressure's higher, but the gravity's stronger. And it turns out the pressure wins, so it would just come out again. If you push a star in like that, it oscillates. And there are some stars that are oscillating and vibrating and so on, but it turns out if you keep on analyzing it and you push it together very far to the incredible concentration of the whole mass of the sun is down to the size of the Earth or smaller, and then it turns out all the nuclear matter, all the nuclei of the atoms are all stuck next to each other tight. The electrons are spaces where the electrons are, and it's all squashed out. And it comes out that when you get to that far, the gravity's strong enough, has overpowered the pressure again. Even though the pressure's got to be enormous, the gravity's got to be even more enormous, and the thing will stay steady at a different size and be nothing but a neutron's nuclear matter, nothing solid nuclear matter. And this is a possibility was worked out by Oppenheimer and Volkov, and it's called a neutron star.
All right. ¿Cómo que cómo? Okay. Oh yeah, let's check. ¿A qué hora? ¿A qué hora? ¿Todavía no? Come on. 15 minutos. Okay.
And
In December, the James Webb Telescope, which is about 1 million miles out there, right, in one of the Lagrange points, confirmed the universe is expanding at an unexpectedly fast rate. Why is it unexpectedly fast, and why does it matter?
Well, it matters. I mean, you're right. In some sense, it doesn't matter, but it matters in the future. So the universe is expanding, and we found out a few decades ago that it's accelerating in its expansion. So it's expanding faster and faster.
Do we know why?
We don't really know why. So in astronomy, if you don't know what something is, you just put dark in front of it. So we call it dark energy. So there's something called dark energy which dominates the universe. That's 3/4 of the energy in the universe or so.
And you
That's
know that
driving
it's
this-
there? Is it measurable?
We know it's there because we measure that the galaxies are moving apart from each other faster and faster. So you can make that measurement. And then you infer, therefore, that something has got to be stretching space faster than we expected.
So
And
wait,
that
well,
gets
let me ask,
called
wait,
dark.
hold on. Space, stretching
does that
space,
sound a bit
stretching
complicated?
space feels a little weird because, okay, so you have all these galaxies. Let's just say these galaxies, all the galaxies in the world were in a 1 by 1 by 1 cube, like 1 foot by 1 foot by 1 foot cube. And if I pulled the cube like this and made the space of the cube bigger, and the galaxies sort of stay in the sort of gelatinous material of space that's inside of it and move with the size of the walls as I pull them out, so they spread apart from each other. Are they really expanding, or are they just changing their position relative to each other because the space that they occupy is growing further apart?
It's a great question. So we're talking about Einstein's theory of general relativity. It's 1915, this theory. And that's a theory of something called space-time. So it's often called the fabric of the universe. So immediately there you can see is this idea that space and time are kind of woven together into a fabric. And the idea really is that that fabric stretches. And you know, the first person to suspect that from the mathematics, because you were talking about the Pope earlier, was a priest, a Catholic priest called Georges Lemaitre. And he was the first to take the theory seriously. And and you imagine he saw it in the equations, this tendency for the space to stretch. So he reasoned, well, then that means that everything was closer together in the past. And he wrote a very famous letter to Einstein and said, your theory suggests there was a day without a yesterday. Because he was imagining, just from the mathematics, he was imagining this time when everything
Well, that's
may have
essentially the
begun.
Big Bang, right?
Yeah.
So he came up with the idea of the Big Bang.
Yeah, so he's often called the father of the Big Bang. And he was once asked, by the way, I was thinking when you were in the interview earlier, he was once asked, how can you be a priest and a physicist and a mathematician and do all this cosmology? He said, there are two roads to the truth and I choose to take them both. Which is a very beautiful answer, isn't it? It's a very poetic man.
In December, the James Webb Telescope, which is about 1 million miles out there, right?
Mark. But I think we can all improve Science and technology have come a long way in making it possible for us to do things that would have seemed like magic tricks not too long ago. Space travel, flight. For most of history, that seemed absolutely impossible. Birds can do it. We're stuck here on the ground, looking up. Think of how many gods and mythical figures were given the power of flight. We wanted it so bad, and now we've managed to do it. The oldest living person in the world was alive when the Wright brothers flew the first flight at Kitty Hawk, and now we have a helicopter on Mars. The more we understand ourselves and our universe, the more magnificent it is. I was brought up with a very scientific worldview. My dad was the astronomer Carl Sagan, and he and my mom, writer-producer Andrianne, fell in love working on the Voyager record, which is a golden phonograph that is a compilation of the sounds of life on Earth. Greetings in human languages and one whale language.
Hello from the planet Earth.
Music from around the world. Sounds of a heartbeat. Brain waves of a young woman in love who happened to be my mom. These two records are on the Voyager spacecrafts, and they have a shelf life of 1 billion years. Right now, the Voyager spacecrafts are the furthest objects from Earth ever touched by human beings. And then my parents wrote essays and books and the television series Cosmos about the awe and wonder that we can find in the universe. Things that we really do understand, that we've managed to discover, can be presented with enthusiasm and wonder and awe that makes people feel welcome in reveling in how astonishing things are in the natural world as revealed by science.
In the last few millennia, we have made the most astonishing and unexpected discoveries about the cosmos and our place within it.
One of the things I learned from my parents is this idea of tolerating ambiguity. Sometimes when we make up an answer, it's just a placeholder because we're so bad at sitting with an empty question mark. But I think we can all improve on sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. Tolerating ambiguity, waiting until you have evidence, knowing that sometimes the evidence will change is central to any scientific advancement. My dad, one of the things he was most curious about in his life was, are we alone in the universe? Is there anybody else out there?
Everyone wants to know how unique the human species are. How is it possible that in a galaxy of 400 billion stars that we're the only inhabited planet? Is that possible?
He was so eager to understand. He wanted to find out what was really going on. But the discomfort we sit with, even with the very small questions, reveals how we feel about the unanswered great mysteries in our lives. It's so hard to not know. Even the future tortures us with our inability to predict it. And we have struggled for eons with this problem. It's a source of so much stress. But science is the only tool that has given us any real shot. I think about a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. An eclipse was terrifying all over the world. The sun goes away all of a sudden. What could be more petrifying? And now we know when they're coming, and we know it's safe, it won't hurt us. Little by little, we're getting some of the tools that we've always longed for through science. Not that long ago for our species, so much in life, even the most mundane, ordinary things, would have seemed like a magic trick. And I think that's true for so much of science and so much of the reality of our universe. And the more we understand ourselves and our planet, the more magnificent it is. My dad felt an enormous, joyful wonder about the universe from his earliest childhood. If he had been born a few hundred years earlier, it would have been a lot harder for him to get the answers that he so deeply craved about our place in the universe. A quote that you often hear of his is, "I don't want to believe, I want to know." And I think that really sums up a lot of his philosophy. He really instilled in me this idea that reality, nature, is more astonishing and more breathtaking than the stories that we create for ourselves.
Yeah, that's true.
You could take any crazy idea. I don't know, it's hard to make up a very crazy one thing, witches or something like that, and you tell about what people used to believe in witches, and of course nobody believes in witches now, and you say, how could they believe in witches? Then you turn around and you say, let's see, what witches do we believe in now? What ceremonies do we do? Every morning we brush our teeth. What is the evidence that the brushing of teeth does us any good in cavities? So you start wondering, are we all, imagine as the Earth turns on the orbit, there's an edge between light and dark. And along that edge, all the people along that edge are doing the same ritual for no good reason. Just like in the Middle Ages, they had other rituals. And you try to picture this perpetual line of toothbrushers going around the Earth. It's to take the world from another point of view. Now, it may well be that brushing teeth is a very good thing because it gets rid of cavities, and you can find out whether it does or it doesn't by trying to find out. Now, you can ask your dentist. He says, of course. And you say, how about evidence? I have not found the evidence from dentists because they just learned it in school. Now, I'm not trying to argue that it's good or bad to brush teeth. What I'm trying to argue for is to think about things from a new point of view. See, I have had in my life a number of pleasant experiences. The earliest one, when I was a kid, I invented a problem for myself, the sum of the powers of the integers. And in trying to get the formula for it, I developed a certain set of numbers formula for which I couldn't get. And I discovered later that those were known as the Bernoulli numbers, and discovered in 1739. So I was up to 1739 when I was about 14, you see. And then a little later I discovered something. I find out they invented a thing called, which we now call operator calculus. And that was invented in 1890 something. You see, I was inventing things that came later and later. But the moment when I began to realize that I was now working on something new was when I read about quantum electrodynamics at the time, and I read a book and I learned about it. For example, I read Dirac's book, and he had these problems that nobody knew how to solve. They were described there. I couldn't understand the book very well because I really wasn't up to it. But there, in the last paragraph at the end of the book, it said, some new ideas are here needed. And so there I was. Some new ideas were needed. Okay, so I started to think of new ideas.
Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, and his son Carl stepped gingerly down the wet cobbles of Millbank, high in the Yorkshire Pennines. Feynman, professor of physics at the California Institute of Technology, retreats to this remote village near his wife's home for a special purpose. It's here he finds the time and solitude to sift the ideas that have made him the most feared and original mind in modern physics. Feynman is in the forefront of one of the oldest and most intriguing games of hide-and-seek in science, finding the ultimate constituents of the world. In this search, Feynman is a celebrated maverick who was encouraged by his father, a New York clothing salesman, to confront conventional wisdom.
One Sunday, all the kids were all walking in little parties with their fathers in the woods. Then the next Monday, we were playing in a field, and kid said to me, say, what's that bird? What's the name of it? Do you know the name of that bird? I says, I have the slightest idea. He said, well, it's a brown-throated thrush. He says, your father doesn't teach you anything. But my father had already taught me about the names of birds. We walked and he says, that's a brown-throated thrush. He says, know what the name of that bird is? It's a brown-throated thrush. In German, it's called a Flügelflögel. In Chinese, it's called a Qinglong Tong. In Japanese, a Tohatahara. And so on. And when you know all the names in every language of that bird, you know nothing, but absolutely nothing about the bird. And then we would go on and talk about the pecking and the feathers. So I had learned already that names don't constitute knowledge. It's the knowing the name of something. That's caused me a certain trouble since, because I refuse to learn the name of anything. So when someone comes in and says, you got any explanation for the Fitz-Cronin experiment? I says, what's that? He says, you know, that the long-lived K meson disintegrates into 2 pies. Oh, yes, now I know. But I never know the names of things. What he forgot to tell me was that knowing the names of things is useful if you want to talk to somebody else. So you tell them what you're talking about.
But the basic principle of knowing about something rather than just knowing its name is something that you stuck to, is it?
Yes, of course. We have to learn. These are kind of disciplines in the field of science that you have to learn. That to know when you know and when you don't know, and what it is you know and what it is you don't know. And it's you got to be very careful not to confuse yourself.
How else did he try and
progress?
Mold your methods of thinking, the way you looked at the world?
Well, we had a lot of little games. Like he would say at the dinner table, he'd think of some little problem. And he'd say, suppose you were a Martian, we were Martians, and we came down to this Earth, and we'd look at it from the outside. And that, I can't explain exactly what he meant, but there's a way of looking something anew, as if you never saw it before, for the first time, and asking questions about it as if you were different. For instance, if you would ask, later I did some little amusing research for a paper in college on sleep. But it started with a question of his kind. Suppose you were a Martian who never slept. They didn't have sleep. You didn't have to sleep. And you came down to this Earth and you saw these people had this funny property that every day for a certain amount of time they had to lie down and become unconscious. And then the natural question would be, how does it feel to get unconscious? What happens to you? Ideas run along and suddenly they stop? Or do they just run more and more slowly? But what happens to your ideas? How does it feel to become unconscious? So I tried to answer the question. What happens when you become unconscious?
But you find that these days, you still, when you're faced with a particularly difficult problem, when you're absolutely stuck, you tend to say, let's look at it like a Martian would look at it. And
sometimes. There are lots of things that people did. For example, Maxwell put the equations together. The Faraday, he formulated the equations mathematically with some model in his head. And then Dirac got his answer by just writing and guessing an equation. And other people got their answer, like in relativity, got the idea by looking at principles of symmetry. Now, all these methods, and Heisenberg got his quantum mechanics by thinking only talk about the things that you can measure. Now, all these ideas, we should only talk about things that we can measure. Try to define things in terms of only things you can measure. Or let's formulate the equation mathematically. Or let's guess the equation. Or all these things are tried all the time. Look for symmetries. All that stuff is tried. All that stuff, when we're going against the problem, we do all that. That's very useful. But we all know that. That's what we learn in the physics classes, how to do that. But the new problem, where we're stuck because all those methods don't work. If any of those methods would have worked, we would have gone through there. So when we get stuck in a certain place, it's a place where history will not repeat herself. And that's makes it even more exciting, because whatever we're going to look at the method and the trick and the way it's going to look is going to be very different than anything that we've seen before, because we've used all the methods from before. So, therefore, a thing like the history of the idea is an accident of how things actually happen. And if I want to turn the history around and try to get a new way of looking at it, it doesn't make any difference. I don't care. The only thing that the real test in physics is experiment, and history is fundamentally irrelevant.
The most enduring legacy from his father was not just learning to question the physical world, but an enthusiasm for the inquiry, which at 54 Feynman still shares today.
It has to do with curiosity. It has to do with people wondering what makes something do something. And then to discover that if you try to get answers, that they're related to each other. That things that make the wind make the waves. And the motion of water is like the motion of air, is like the motion of sand. The fact that things have common features turns out more and more universal. What we're looking for is how everything works, and what makes everything work. And what happens first in the history is we discover the things that are on the face of it obvious. And then gradually that we ask more questions, and then we dig in a little deeper to things that we can just make. We need to do a little more complicated experiment to find out about it. But it's curiosity as to where we are, what we are. It's very much more exciting to discover we're on a ball, half of it sticking upside down. It's spinning around in space. It's a mysterious force which holds us on. It's going around a great big glob of gas that's burning fueled by a fire. That's completely different than the fire, any fire we can make. Well, now we can make that fire, nuclear fire. But that's a much more exciting story to many people than the tales which other people used to make up who worried about the universe, that we were living on the back of a turtle or something like that. They were wonderful stories, but the truth is so much more remarkable. And so what's the pleasure in physics is that, to me, is that as it's revealed, the truth is so remarkable, so amazing. And I have this disease, and many other people who have studied far enough to begin to understand a little of how things work are fascinated by it. And this fascination drives them on to such an extent that they've been able to convince governments and so on to keep supporting them in this investigation that the race is making into its own environment.
As a theoretical physicist, Feynman doesn't have a laboratory, and he finds family relaxation helps him to concentrate. In recent years, he's been concerned with the long-asked, almost childlike question, what are things really made of? What makes up the world we see around us? Have we at last come to the foundation stone from which we can make anything? A tree, a human being? Or must we go on looking at smaller and smaller pieces and going deeper and deeper into a bottomless pit? Feynman is trying to knit together our scattered knowledge of the smallest pieces of matter to see whether they fit a pattern. The problem, although fundamentally important to all branches of science, seems far removed from everyday reality.
The world is strange. The whole universe is very strange. But see, when you look at the detail and you find out that the rules are very simple of the game, the mechanical rules by which you can figure out exactly what's going to happen when the situation is simple. It's again this chess game business. If you were in just a corner where only a few pieces are involved, you can work out exactly what's going to happen. And you can always do that when there's only a few pieces. And so you know you understand it. And yet, in the real game, there's so many pieces you can't figure out what's going to happen. So there was a kind of hierarchy of different complexities. It's hard to believe. It's incredible. In fact, most people don't believe that the behavior of, say, me, Juan Yak, and you nodding and all this stuff is the result of lots and lots of atoms all obeying these very simple rules come out, that it evolves into such a creature that a billion years of life with its experiences has produced